Hello, this is Scott Kress with this month's B&M Pro Staff Tip of the Month. This month is November, and it's one of my favorite months of the year to catch giant catfish. Really giant any fish for that matter. It's the fall feeding season, the fish are getting fat, they know the days are getting shorter, and they got to get their feed bag on before the winter sets in. Now when chasing giant catfish, I like to use giant bait. Now most of you think giant bait means just heads or giant chunks, but when I say giant bait, I mean giant bait. There really is not a skipjack that's too big that you cannot use even whole. I often use 4+ pound baits. Now when fishing giant bait, you really need to use a double hook rig. Very rarely do I use a double hook rig. I really like to keep things simple. Even when I'm using just big heads by themselves, I'll just generally use a single hook rig. But when I'm fishing 3+ pound baits, you really need to go with a double hook rig. When I'm doing that, I'll typically tie just really a standard double Snell rig. Now how far apart the hooks are really depends on how big of a bait you're going to use. And how far the leader is before the first hook really depends on how fast the current is. Now on the business end of my lines, I only use Palomar knots down to Snell knots. I'll use an improved clinch knot on a dropper rig to the sinker, but for my main line, if you tie it in the right order, it can all be Palomar straight down to double Snell rigs for both hooks. Now I happen to like Daiichi offset 8/0 hooks, Charlie Browns, but whatever you use is fine. Now I learned this trick really from growing up striper fishing. We've caught some monster striped bass on using the biggest skipjack we can catch. And I've caught them 20-pound striped bass using whole 4-pound baits before. So I really know that, that turns into catfishing too. You really cannot use a bait that's too big. So typically the way I hook these baits, for illustrative purposes, I've just got this old 11-inch freezer burn skipjack. But let's pretend for a minute that this is actually a Mongo 20-inch bait. And what I'll typically do is a couple of things. I'll either fish the whole bait by itself. And when I do that, typically I'll just score the bait to get the juices flowing. Or another thing I like to do if I really want maximum scent in the water is I'll cut the bait right behind the gills as far as I can to just barely get the head off, and then I'll slice off the tail and I'll use the complete the body section. Now even when I have the head on, I typically never go through the mouth. A giant skipjack's top nose is way too bony, and I don't think enough hook really gets popped through. When I hook it through the bottom section of the mouth, even though a lot of hook comes out, typically when I reel that bait up, its gills are all flared out from the current, and it just doesn't look right to me. So almost all the time I will hook these things through the meat. And what I mean by that is I'll take, if I'm using a whole bait, I'll typically just go as far close to the head as I can, get the first top hook through, just enough that I've got the hook as much as possible out with a decent amount of hook still exposed. Make sure, as always, that any scales are knocked off. And then depending on the size of the bait, again, I'm using a smaller than normal bait today, but ultimately right before the tail, I'll do the same thing with the bottom hook. This will go onto the business end, usually with about an 8-ounce sinker up top, and I'll fish this bait this way. Now if I'm going to cut this bait and not use the head and look for maximum scent, again I'll cut as close to the back of the head as I can, leaving as much of the body of the skipjack exposed. Now this obviously is a frozen bait, but if this was a fresh 20-incher, you'd see a lot of blood, guts, and ooze coming out of here. Now when I've got a bait cut this way, typically what I'll do is I'll also cut off the back part of the tail. Now my favorite way to hook these types of baits is I'll go right through the meat here and then come out the top. This will always usually give me a pretty good hook set where the bait's not going to come off. And then I'll do the same thing on the back. Again, make sure the scales are off. Now I've got a double hook rig sitting this way. So if you want to chase trophy catfish in the month of November, or really any time of year, and I've always been a go big or go home guy, try using giant bait. Believe me, you can't go that big.